series. And my name is Zhao Ma. I'm Associate Professor of Modern Chinese History and Culture in the Department of East Asian Language and Cultures at Washington University in St. Louis. So I'm also the principal investigator of this project. So because today is our first official event supported by the project, so I want to take maybe a couple minutes to explain what we are trying to do or what we are trying to accomplish. So Global Qing and its Legacies is a 3-year research and teaching project aiming at exploring the Qing Empire and its aftermath from a global perspective. So in a very bold statement, we hope to investigate how the rise and fall of the Qing Empire participated and even shaped the international relations, trade structure, technology, and the flow of people and idea in early modern and modern world. So both the success and the failures of the Qing Empire and forces that contributed to its success and failures, it casts a long shadow over the world that we are living today. So in the areas of ethnic relations, trade frictions, territorial disputes, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Qing dynasty refuses to quietly sit on the sideline, and it calls our attention and it calls for more research. So today's event is an inaugural lecture of the lecture series supported by the Global Qing and its Legacy project. The series features scholars who are producing cutting-edge scholarship on the Qing and on Qing history. So in terms of a cutting-edge scholarship, I'm so thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Professor David Brophy. So Professor Brophy is a senior lecturer in modern Chinese history at the University of Sydney. He earned his PhD at Harvard in 2011 and worked as a postdoc fellow at the Australian National University from 2011 to 2013. From 2017 to 2020, he was a Australian Research Council Early Career Fellowship for a project entitled Empire and Religion in Early Modern Inner Asia. His first book, Uyghur Nation, Reform and Revolution on the Russian-China Frontier, was published by Harvard University Press in 2016. And I can tell you there are only 11 copies left on Amazon. So if you want to get a copy, order quickly. He has a forthcoming book, China Panic, Australia's Alternative to Paranoid and Pandering, so which will be published by La Trobe University Press. So it is a very timely and important subject. So today's talk is based on another book by Professor Brophy. This is a translation project. The title is in Remembrance of the Saint, the Rise and the Fall of the Inner Asian Sufi Dynasty. So published by the Columbia University. So before giving the floor to Professor Brophy, I want to thank a number of people. First of all, Mr. Peter Yang, who is a Washington University alumnus. He and his wife, Lin Yang, established a research fund that makes this research project possible and today's lecture possible. So I want to thank them for their generous support. And also I want to thank Serena Wu, and his team and her team at the Washington University China Forum, and also Christelle Maury at my department, East Asian Language and Cultures, for taking care of all the logistics. And so one final note for today's audience, audience can submit their questions by using the chat box. And when asking questions, so please make sure, put your name and affiliation so we know who you are. And then keep your question clear and concise, because we do hope to answer as many questions as possible. And so now, without further ado, I want to turn the floor to Professor Brophy.
Thank you very much, Zhao, for the introduction. And thank you to you and to Ulu and to the China Forum and everyone at WashU for helping to organize this event. This is really exciting for me. I've been working on this project for way too long. This goes back to my time as a graduate student. So, 15 years is probably the last, 15 years ago is probably when I first picked up this, this text, and I've been working on it on and off. And I've finally took advantage of this, the fellowship that you mentioned to finish it off. And so this is the first time I've actually had an opportunity to talk to people about it post publication. And it's really nice to see so many people in the room. So thank you all for being here. Now, let me just get my PowerPoint going. Now you can see that, hopefully. How's that? And I'll share that. Yeah. Okay. So look, time is relatively short, so I really just wanted to hit upon a few issues in the to do with the text and the context of this work, and touch on issues that, of course, we can go into in the Q&A section. In Remembrance of the Saints that's just my effort to render the title of this manuscript work, the Tazkire Azizan, which was the most popular, widely circulating work of original local literature in the Qianlong period after the Qing conquest, and the most important work that is written in the wake of the Qing conquest and attempts to grapple in some way with that transition period in the 18th century. So just a little bit of background. Between the decline in the Tarim Basin of the Chaghatay dynasty, essentially the sort of the end point of the Mongol Empire, and the arrival of the Qing in the 18th century, there is this period that is sometimes conveniently referred to as the Hoja period. Now, Hoja is the name that's given to these religious elites in this region who belong to Sufi lineages, and also claim descent from the Prophet Muhammad. So therefore Sayyids also ruled for a period about half a century in collaboration with the Jungar Mongol state to the north. And if you're familiar with Qing history, you know that the Jungar Mongols were for a long time the main rivals of the Qing Empire in the northwest. Period of Qing conquest was quite drawn out in the 1750s. It involved actually 4 separate military expeditions. The first of these resulted in the downfall of the ruling Hoja dynasty, which is really the drama at the center of this work. That initial invasion ultimately resulted in another rebellion a couple of years later, and then as sort of the last of these expeditions went in and installed a more direct system of Qing rule in the to the south of the Heavenly Mountains. And the patrons of this text were beneficiaries of that final invasion, and these were people who'd been created as Qing aristocrats, and given important positions like the governorship of Kashgar. And these are the patrons of this work. There's actually the governor, and interestingly enough, also his mother is a patron of this text. And this was written in the 1780s, so about 20 odd years after, 25 years after the events it describes. It's written by a man by the name of Muhammad Sadiq Kashgari, who was, we don't know too much about his life, but he was active from, I think we can say, from the 1780s to the 1820s. His other works are mostly works of translation, translated a variety of historical works. And he also authored a couple of more original works on ethics and law. As far as we can tell from his career, this In Remembrance of the Saints was one of his first works. And as I said, it was quite a popular work. It's exists in, we know of about 30 different manuscripts with 3 different versions of the text. It still exists even in private hands in China today. Although, of course, given the political situation in Xinjiang right now, we have to be conscious that that is going to have a huge impact on people's ability to, to study and bring to light new examples of this text. Given the fact that there's a considerable number of prominent philologists who just disappeared in recent years in Xinjiang, and that that's having a huge impact generally across the board in terms of the study of the Islamic heritage there. I wasn't I wasn't thinking about that kind of thing when I first set out on this project, but as I was concluding it, it was very much on my mind. This text has been known to the outside world since the 1850s, since the Russian Kazakh Churkan Valley Khanov visited Kashgar in the 1850s and found a couple of copies of this text. British visitors subsequently also took copies away, and there's a number of these manuscripts are in libraries in different parts of the world. So just again, a little bit more background, just so we're sort of familiar with the region that we're talking about here. This is a map from the viewpoint of Central Asia. So we're looking over here in the east with the Dzungars in the north, in essentially what is now Dzungaria. And then the real centers of action, Kashgar, Yakand, Khotan here in the south. We want to look at this from a Qing point of view. This is a map of the Qianlong Emperor's campaigns in the 1750s. As I said, 4 separate campaigns, 4 separate expeditions, ultimately to defeat the Dzungars and then incorporate the south. The other thing, and I know that these can be difficult to look at, but anyway, here's a family tree of the Hodjas that I'm talking about, and I don't want to sort of confuse people too much, but just to say, we're talking here about a family that belonged to a tradition of Sufi practice that they've inherited through sort of master-disciple type initiation, but have essentially become a kind of a Sufi dynasty in the sense of transmission of this religious charisma from father to son. Key figures here being these saints from Samarkand in what's now Uzbekistan, so Makhdumi Azam, Ishaq Vali, who came to the Tarim Basin first, Afaq Hoja, or Hoja Afaq over here. It's his shrine in Kashgar, the large domed shrine that is the most important Sufi shrine in Kashgar. And then there's a sort of the real hero of the text that I'm talking about is this guy actually, Hoja Yaqub, Hoja Jahan, who belongs to the line of Ishaq Vali. And it's the rivalry between these different groups that's really at the center of the story. The bad guys in this movie are these two, who are known in Chinese as Da Xiao He Zhuo, if you're familiar with the Chinese historiography here. These are the people who were initially sent down to rule on behalf of the Qing in 1755 and end up wiping out their rivals, such as Hoja Yaqub. And they themselves are then removed in the final Qing invasion, sent fleeing into Afghanistan. Okay, so, and their family is known as the White Mountain Hodjas. The rest are known as the Black Mountain Hodjas. And if anyone's interested in discussing this terminology, I'm more than happy to come back to it. Let me say a little bit about genre, because this term Tazkira in the title, we tend to associate with hagiography. It's the life of a saint or a group of saints in usually in one of these Sufi traditions. That's generally what the term connotes. This is quite an unusual kind of hagiography, though, in the sense that it's describing a Sufi lineage that has essentially been wiped out by this conquest. So the lineage is finished. The author's own relationship to this Sufi community is a little bit unclear. It's not clear whether or not he was just writing this because he was commissioned to do it, or he had some investment in this community either. And again, that's unusual. These things do tend to get produced from within this community. And I think that some of these quirks in terms of the task at hand are reflected in the structure of this work, because it really evolves from a fairly standard hagiographic work into something quite different. So, the first few sections are really just translation and adaptation of previous hagiographic works, focusing on some of these key figures in the lineage. What he's doing here is basically just taking Persian hagiographies and translating them and adapting them and stringing them together. What he does then, when he gets to the end of that, what he has at hand, he then sort of tries to continue the story in a hagiographic style. What I mean by that is sections dedicated to the biography of each figure, anecdotes, that from disciples, so and so told me that, and not much attention to the sort of temporal ordering of these things. The focus really is just on these stories that demonstrate the the eminence of this lineage. So we have here, some famous vignettes. For example, the story of Hoja Afak's trip to Tibet, his contracting of an alliance with the Jungar Mongol Galdan. The real hero here, as I mentioned, is this figure Hoja Yaqub, who's also known as Hoja Jahan. And in fact, some manuscripts of this text are referred to as Tazkirat al-Jahan, which is sort of like the biography of Mr. Jahan, you could understand as, and that may have actually been a separate composition that was then set within this larger work. And it also contains quite a long doctrinal discussion. When he gets to this central figure, he then kind of steps back and does this whole doctrinal discussion to really demonstrate that this person has the credentials, both in a spiritual sense and a physical genealogical sense, for the claims to greatness that he is that are being made. After this, though, the text really shifts, and it shifts really noticeably in style as it begins to narrate this civil war that is breaking out as the Jungar Mongol rule is fracturing, and opportunities emerge initially for the Hodjas to assert themselves independently as Islamic rulers in the south, and then eventually the conflict that's precipitated by the arrival of the Qing dynasty. The style here is much more in the form of a kind of historiography or epic. The sections are designated as dastan, which is a sort of the epic genre. He is he's interspersing the prose narrative with his own poetry to kind of give his own reflection on events. And the Hodjas, to some extent, actually take a back seat at this point, and the sort of the secular elite, the begs as they're known, kind of come to the fore as the main actors, and are the ones who are sort of driving the narrative. I wanted to just give you a sense of sort of like the mood of this text. What the kind of the overarching feeling as you read it is. And I thought I would just kind of give you one of these poems whole to give you that to give you that sense. And it really is one of impending doom as we lead up to the cataclysm at the end, when the Hodja family is wiped out. And martyrdom is a huge theme as well. And particularly when you look at the last couple of lines of this poetry, you do get this sense of a community that's kind of embattled from all sides, and not just from non-Muslim enemies, but also from the nomadic communities, the Kyrgyz and the Kazakh. The nomadic sedentary divide being very significant. Now, the people have generally sort of tried to mine these texts for specific points of data. I don't want to do any of that, but I did just want to touch on a few questions as to sort of what is the author's attitude towards the events he's describing, and just a couple of simple questions about, for example, what is his attitude to this period of Hodja rule? What does he think about this idea of these Sufis governing the oases of his society? And actually, for all the work he puts into glorifying the court and the culture in this Hodja period, there are passages where he talks about this was just like the age of Hossein Mirza, the famous Timurid, kind of golden age. But there's a lot of hints in the text that he's actually not very comfortable with this situation. So, for example, when he talks about Afak Hoxha, he says like his position as Hoxha did not sit well with worldly rule. And then when he's talking about the people he's most interested in, he puts these speeches into their mouths, sort of always talking about how what we really needed to do was to bring back the Chaghatayids and reestablish this traditional system of the ruler, the Khan, with his spiritual advisor at his side. There's this sort of two roles that needed to be restored. And there's a little bit in the text about this sort of critique of the what is presented as a virtue practiced by these Sufi saints, if you will, this sort of extreme reliance on God and an unwillingness to sort of show too much initiative in intervening in events. There is a sort of a subtle line of criticism through the text of this. And certainly in the second half of the book, these Hoxhas are not working miracles. They're not really able to sort of wield their charisma to change the course of events. And in that sense, it becomes quite a secular text. Another interesting question is, his attitude towards the Jungar Mongols. And this is really one of the few Central Asian texts that give us any sense of the interaction between the Jungar Mongols and the peoples that they were ruling, the non-Buddhist, non-Mongol peoples that they were ruling. And if you're familiar with the sort of the Central Asian literary tradition, say in the sort of Kyrgyz or Kazakh epic tradition, you know that the Jungars, or the Kalmucks as they're known, these are the bad guys par excellence. These are the bogeymen. These are the eternal enemy. And there is quite a lot of that in this text. I mean, they are clearly infidels. A situation of infidel rule is intolerable. But you also get a lot of interesting vignettes that involve kind of cross-culturation. People can clearly speak Mongolian. There are situations where, people sort of dress up as Mongols to, for some particular purpose. There are even Hoxhas who are accorded, huge praise in the text, who actually essentially brought up as Mongols. So Hoxha Yusuf, for example, he is the brother of Hoxha Jahan. He was, his mother was enslaved. We're getting here the sort of some literary depictions of the slavery that was going on as well. He was enslaved and brought up and educated in the Kalmuk fashion, essentially, until he was 7. There are some very pro-Kalmuk begs in the story who tend to kind of get a bad rap. They're quite criticized. They when they defend themselves and when they sort of defend their stance, the type of thing that they say is, well, if we weren't working with the Jungars, then it would be the Kyrgyz. So the idea that essentially we're vulnerable to the power of this sort of nomadic formations that surround us, and it's really sort of a choice of one or the other. And there's no sense in this book that being dominated by the Kyrgyz would be in any way better. In fact, the Kyrgyz are in some ways sort of more reviled in this text than the Jungars. And then there's a quote there from the last poem in the book where he's talking about the White Mountain Hoxhas who came in and killed his heroes. And this was much worse than anything that the Kalmucks had done. So that's from a Saki Name, which is the ode to the cupbearer. So it always begins with, saying to the cupbearer, bring me that drink. And that's the way that he ends this book. So what about the Qing? What does he say about the Qing? I think one of the key questions, and it's still really hard for me to give you an answer to this, is how do you explain the fact that a work that is full of rhetoric extolling the virtues of holy war, the this period in which these Hodjas were able to kind of put up some resistance to these the Drunga domination. It's really a lot of discussion of the importance of holy war when you have the opportunity to do it. How do you explain that this was written for a Muslim aristocrat who was owed his position to his relationship to the non-Muslim Qing? And it's a difficult question to answer. Of course, the text is full of this praise at the beginning and throughout for his the author's patrons, to demonstrate that we are living in a prosperous time in which the norms of Islamic social life are being observed, and that clearly that's possible, and that reflects to some extent a view of the situation under the Qing. But the fact is, the book actually stops before the arrival of the Qing. It peters out just before. So the emperor is in the background during the first invasion, but it doesn't go into the 1760s at all. Was it because that was too difficult? Was it because it was too sensitive to write about? It's hard to say. There is one interesting passage, though, that does seem to kind of prophesy the Qing conquest in the end, the 1759 invasion. It's a poem written by the hero of the story, Hodja Jahan. It's on the left there, where he's predicting that his family will be, driven out, killed, and so on. But then he also predicts that, from the east, certain friends of ours will come and take revenge for us. And it's a sort of an indirect allusion, I think, to what is to come after the end of the book. It's interesting to think, did he actually write this? There are other manuscripts of his poetry that include this poem, and they include this passage. So it sort of seems that this may be an authentic poem, but it does also seem to kind of predict what is to come. It's quite a enigma. And then you see in the final poem, again on the right, there is this engagement with people in the author's time and day and time who are still defending the actions of the White Mountain Hodjas, and you get a sense of this kind of ongoing sectarian conflict in this period that the author is intervening in. All right, so I don't want to take up too much more time. I'll probably just take another 5 minutes, perhaps. And so that's in terms of the text itself. I just wanted to say something about the context in which the author is writing, because this can also be a source for Qianlong period Xinjiang. The 1780s in which this is being written, this was a transitional decade in Qing Xinjiang. It was a period in which a lot of the original aristocrats, collaborators with the Qing invasion, who belonged to various different factions politically in the Tarim Basin, a lot of those figures were dying, moving on. And that then created an opportunity, I think, for one particular family in this mix to come in and sort of set the record straight. And what you see in the text is often when there are key conflicts or key battles, that kind of thing, you get this sort of listing of who is on which side. And I think that was really, that was partly about trying to kind of construct a master narrative that would, paint things the way that this particular family wanted the story to be told. I think the hostility as well that the text evinces towards the Kyrgyz, the skepticism towards their, the strength of their Islamic faith and so on. I think we can also potentially link this to renewed conflict between the sort of sedentary society in the Tarim Basin and the Kyrgyz in the 1780s. The 1780s was a period in which the kind of the initial Qing policy for managing the Kyrgyz really broke down. And that was also connected to the return in the 1780s of one sole surviving member of the White Mountain Hodja family who'd been driven into Afghanistan, one sole surviving son who'd been on a journey through Afghanistan, Bukhara, and comes back to the neighboring region and tries to make contact with his loyalists in Kashgar. And accusations start flying back and forth between various elite factions that, you're in league with this guy, no, you're in league with this guy. And it all becomes very dangerous. And the patron of this text actually almost loses his head because of this. And so again, I think that created this incentive to really try to set the record straight. One interesting question is the text's attitude towards the survival of any spiritual lineage from the people that he's talking about, because essentially his text ends with their death. But we know, thanks to other sources, that even if there was no genealogical survivor of this Sufi family, there were devotees, there were disciples, there were, and there were forms of transmission still going on into the Qianlong period. And those are really obscured in this text. They're not talked about. And I think that reflects the fact that this is being patronized by a beg family who doesn't necessarily want to really call attention to that, those alternative sources of authority. But there are interesting passages, that hint at some kind of survival. There's a passage at the end where certain children of deputies of these saints are sent off to escape, which is sort of likened to the flight of Muhammad from Mecca. There is the occasional mention of elderly devotees who remain faithful, but there is no mention of a living lineage, which, as to go back to an earlier point, this is what makes this quite unusual as a hagiography. And then we can look at the manuscripts themselves for a little bit of evidence as to how this was being read, what sort of significance it had for the community in Xinjiang. And there's three different versions basically of this text. The one that I translated is one that I think is the original version. I'm calling it an ecumenical version, in that it's very hostile to the people that designated as enemies, but in other respects it's trying to build some bridges between say other members of the Afak Hodja's family line and the Isap Valley's family line. There's some reconciliation going on. There is another version which is much more sectarian, much more hostile to Kashgar, Kashgaris, and to the entire family of Afak Hodja. That's quite noticeable. And then there are versions that just kind of get rid of a lot of the Sufi stuff, remove this doctrinal discussions and so on. And I think possibly reflecting a kind of a waning of interest in that discussion as we get into the 19th century. And both new Sufi lineages are coming in and influencing things, but also I think the beginning of a kind of a critique of Sufism too. So anyway, that's probably all I have time to talk about by way of introduction. I'm hoping that now that we have this text as a whole, that people can read it and find new questions to ask as well, from possibly from a literary standpoint, once you're able to actually kind of read this as a complete work, rather than, as we tend to do, to sort of dip into sections here and there. We can get a little bit, we can get some new perspectives on what people like Kashgari were doing and the traditions they brought to bear in these sorts of tasks. So that's where I'll end it. I should also just mention, it'd be wonderful if you could order the book for your library. And if you'd like to get a discount, I think it brings the paperback down, to below $30. So please make use of that discount code. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, David.
Stop my sharing. Yep, there we go.
Here we go. All right. So thanks a lot to David for this wonderful presentation. And so now we get into the Q&A sessions. And so we do have a couple of questions coming up already. And I guess maybe I'll take advantage of my position as a moderator. So just get a kickoff the Q&A session with a very quick question. So could you maybe comment more on the language used in in this manuscript and how widespread it has been used in the past? And in addition to this particular manuscript, what other documents or memoirs that we can find in this language, and how that kind of changed the ways in which we understand this particular period and this part of the Qing Empire?
Okay, this is written in what we call Chaghatay. People didn't call it Chaghatay themselves; they just called it Turkey. So basically Turkish. We tend to use, in English, we tend to use the word Turkish for Anatolian Turkish, of course, and talk about Turkic in Central Asia. But this is a literary language that has, it has some precedence in the pre-Mongol period, but really kind of comes into its own in the post-Mongol period. Across Central Asia, people are writing in this language from, say, Hami in the east through to Khiva and up into the Volga region in Russia. That's the whole region in which this is, and it's it's even sort of poets occasionally in the Ottoman Empire would write in this language too. So it's quite a sort of international thing, and it sort of exists alongside Persian, Arabic, of course. There was much less original composition in Persian in Xinjiang in Eastern Turkestan versus Western Turkestan, but I mean, Kashgari himself, I think, is obviously quite comfortable with Persian. He's translating a lot from Persian into Chaghatay. Now, of course, all the various national traditions sort of lay claim to this. So, sometimes people refer to Chaghatay as Old Uzbek. Sometimes people refer to it as Old Uyghur. Just depends on where you are and who you're talking to. But it is really the literary precursor for modern Uyghur. And it's there's a lot of material out there. This, I would say, is written in a fairly high style. It is really attempting to kind of connect to the tradition that goes back to the Timurids. There's a lot of quotations from the famous poets like Alisher Nevai. There's also quite a lot of quotations of Indian poets as well in Persian. So it's really trying to maintain this connection to this wider literary community. That is, I think, in that sense, I think it's sort of, it's kind of the last text from Kashgar to really try and do that. Once you get into the 19th century, I mean, there's a whole flurry of historical writing around the time of Yaqub Beg and the rebellion and so on, but it doesn't really tap into these kind of literary tropes and these poetic corpus in the way that this text does. I hope that's enough for a start, but we can come back to that. Yeah.
All right. So let me get the question from the audience. So here's a question from Muhammad Uyghur. sorry, if I mispronounce your names, I'm very sorry. So, and it's an independent scholar. And so his question is regarding the White Mountain and Black Mountain sects of Hojas. I have this suspicion that they are originally white hats and the black hats. And so, but later gradually changed orally to current misnomer. So, but I might be completely wrong. So I would like to get your insights on this.
Okay, just quickly, yeah. Look, the sources, this particular text doesn't use the terminology of Black Mountain, White Mountain at all. There might be one mention of Black Mountain, but I've looked at the various sources from the 18th century, and it's very clear that the original word here is Tag, is mountain. I don't think there can really be any doubt about that. What I think we do need to pay more attention to is to, what these terms actually mean. I argue, because briefly, just White Mountain, Black Mountain, these have been assumed to be synonymous with the Afakiya, the lineage of Afak, and Isakiya, the lineage of Ishak. I come to the conclusion that that's not the case. That Black Mountain is a term that really comes into being thanks to the Qing conquest, in the way that, and in the conflict described in this text, it brings together a section of the lineage of Hoja Afak with the lineage of Hoja Ishak together against the people who are identified as the White Mountain. So the traditional understanding of this terminological divide is a bit off, and I have a whole article I'll put it in the chat just to point people towards. Yeah, but this taqiya thing, I don't subscribe to that theory. Yeah.
Okay, so we do our next question. It's about the mostly historiography and historical research on Xinjiang, as well as the in the context of the current crisis in Xinjiang, with the really difficult things going on there. And so, question is from Garrett Allen. So, is this work or works by historical scholars in Xinjiang taught to Uyghur students in China? To what extent is this text part of what the CCP is currently trying to wipe out?
Yeah, I would say that, without being able to comment specifically on the fate of this text, I would say that, very likely that this is a sort of material that's being targeted. There was a modern Uyghur language edition of this text published in the 1980s. So essentially what you do is you take the manuscript and then you kind of modify the language a bit, you change the script to the modern Uyghur script and so on. And you can basically just publish in modern Uyghur, and that has been, that's circulated, has been sold in shops. That's, to my knowledge, that has never really come under scrutiny. But I think it's extremely likely that, given some of the content of this material, that it would be now. It was not the kind of thing that was ever really sort of part of the curriculum or anything like that. It was always something that was, would be for specialized study. There have been some Chinese translations of this as well, so it is kind of known to the Chinese translations of partial English translations. So it is kind of it is sort of known, and the clearly things like any discussion of holy war, the difficulties of living under infidel rule, that kind of thing, that is very much the kind of thing that could land you in serious trouble. And I would assume that sort of possessing manuscripts that look like, old religious books, that too is enough to get people in trouble today, regardless really of the content. So yeah,
Mhm. Well, actually, Garrett Allen has a second question, which is still about the relationship between center and local. And
Yep.
so, but this is more in the Qing context. So did Beijing's oppressive relationship with Xinjiang begin with the four Qing expedition in 1755 to
Yep.
1759? Or did it begin with Zuozongtang's expedition in the, I think it's in the 1880s?
Well, 1880s. Yeah, you're right. Look, these are very different phases of Qing rule. So the period that I'm that's described in the introduction here, this is it's still a relatively hands-off system. There's no question that it's part of the Qing Empire. Yeah, and the Qing is running taxation and is stationing garrisons and putting impositions on the local population for that and this kind of thing. But in terms of day-to-day administration, you had what was called the beg system, which was largely administered by these people who'd been made aristocrats and therefore sort of brought into the multinational, multi-confessional Qing imperial elite. These are people who are sort of beneficiaries very much of the invasion. The post Zuozongtang, that's when you get the conversion of Xinjiang to a province. So the administrative assimilation of the region and efforts to inculcate Chinese language, Chinese customs into the younger generation, policies that are much more comparable to the situation today than anything we see in the Qianlong period. So how you want to weigh up, the level of oppression in these different periods, well, that's something for people to sort of read and work out. But it's two quite different styles of rule.
All right. So the next question is from Chuck Woodridge, so a friend, and it's from the Lehman College, City University of New York. So he is asking, could you say a bit more about the doctrinal dispute in the text? Would the Qing, or at least the patron of the text, had a particular stake in a given doctrinal stance in the Sufism?
Yeah. Basically, it concerns the question of the inheritance of the religious charisma from within the Naqshbandi tradition. And so the key line of division is to say that, well, there are these two branches of the family, and well, I mean, the text that I'm translating and why I call it the ecumenical version is that it says, well, some people say this, some people say that, these people got it. Other people say that these people got it, but let's just say that, like, well, neither of these are completely without a share of this tradition. Yeah. And I think that reflects the viewpoint of an aristocratic family who were interested in commemorating, celebrating, and, an elite Sufi family that they had a relationship to in terms of intermarriage and so on, but not pouring fuel on the sectarian fire. I think that was the sort of the standpoint of this new Qing elite. There were, though, people who were interested in pouring fuel on the sectarian fire. And that's why I think you get these redactions saying that, no, we have exclusive claim to this, this lineage. Did the Qing understand anything about this? Initially, during the initial invasion, up until the 1780s, there's nothing in Qing sources to suggest that they're aware of these divisions. But you do get it in the 1780s when you get the return of Samsak, as I said, and it creates this crisis. And officials go down to the south, to Kashgar, and ask what's going on, and they get this terminology. They get this Black Mountain, White Mountain thing. But it's not really understood in terms of in terms of the categories of Sufism. It's really just understood in terms of political loyalties. and that there are these people who support this, this lineage, and those people support that lineage. And it's quite possible that the emperor would have been having discussions at the court with, we know that he was talking to people who were, some of these Sufi families actually ended up living in Beijing as aristocrats. And we know that the emperor was engaging with them on questions of Islamic doctrine and so on. I haven't found any record though of him talking about Sufi divisions, but he was asking them things about like the Hajj, where is Mecca, what is this thing, and so on. So it's possible that he had some knowledge via that route, but I haven't found any evidence of it yet.
So actually, there's a follow-up question or a similar question along the line of this religious part of the text and the family. So we have a question from Taylor Fordry, is a student from Washington University. So she is wondering what you believe the significance of Sufi religion in Qing China at the time, and did it have any greater political impact?
Yeah, so it's the well, the division that crystallizes in the 1750s, it remains salient up until the the 1820s, 1830s, when you get, if you read something like Laura Newby's book about the Qing Empire in Kokand, this idea of the White Mountain Sufis as these rebels who are outside the empire, and the Black Mountain is essentially the faction of order, the loyalist faction, which the problem is when we're talking about these categories, sometimes they're referring to, sometimes they're just referring to these kind of large political factions. Sometimes we can actually zoom in and actually get a sense of a living Sufi tradition. But, those things are not really the same thing, right? So for example, if we want to trace like who are the sheikhs, the influential sheikhs, that carrying on this tradition into the 19th century, that can be a challenge. It can be really, really difficult. But this is sort of getting a bit complicated, but once we have a slightly better picture of the nature of these categories and their meaning, we can start to pick up more out of the Qing sources that was previously a little bit sort of opaque to us. So I just put that article in the chat. One of the things I do in that article is to kind of reinterpret an uprising in the early 19th century that was misunderstood in terms of its relationship to these Sufi loyalties and so on, and put that on a better basis. So, the answer is that yes, these networks are still playing a considerable role. But I think it's either, but there's a lot that is also, I think the ones that survive the best are the ones that are sort of married to these kind of aristocratic official traditions in a safe way, Sufi lineages, Sufi groups inside Qing Xinjiang that try to retain a sort of independent existence, and they tend to suffer, repression and eventually sort of just dry up by the 19th century. There's lots of interesting stuff coming in from India and so on as well to kind of replenish the Sufi scene in the 19th century too.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions in the chat box. So let me read these two questions first. One is from Kudrat Amin. So, and what was the region called officially? What did the people, locals call it? Was there any uniformity in the region? And also kind of maybe is again related question, complicated political dynamic in the region. Lan Wu from the Mount Holyoke College asked, how did the text talk about the Dzungars? So 2 questions.
Yeah. There is, in the introduction, he talks about when he's sort of praising Kashgar as this wonderful city. He talks about it as located in both Mogolistan, which is the essentially just means Mongolia. The Mongol Empire, their ruling elite, they obviously, they call themselves Mongols, Moguls, and that's what they were, that's what outsiders called them too. With the consolidation of the Chaghatay dynasty in this part of Central Asia, this became known as Mogolistan. But he uses that in parallel with Turkestan. Okay, so Turkestan is very much in use by this time. It's not a, it's not a modern invention by foreigners. It's Mogolistan, Turkestan. There's another point in the text where he puts a speech in someone's mouth, and he says, and he uses the term Al-Tashahar, the six cities. So there's not really any consistency, but there's not really a lot of points in the text where the author needs to use a term for this region as a whole, because he talks about these various oases as independent, well, not as independent, but as, their own. I mean, the term he uses is memleket, that these are these little city states that are all, they're being governed by different members of this this family, and that's the level at which he's narrating these events, much more than any kind of big us versus them story. When he wants to talk about his own community, he just talks about them as Musulman. We can say that there's a certain specificity to that, because he might occasionally contrast, the Musulmans to the Kyrgyz or the Kazakh, who are in theory Muslims as well. When he says Musulman, he really means the settled population of the oases. The Dzungars, yeah. So I said a couple of points about the Dzungars. There are good and bad Dzungars. There are some who are working in the interests of the Muslims. Even at the height of this kind of enthusiasm for holy war, there's a distinction being made between the ones that, we want to sort of drive out and kill, and the ones who are, on our side. There's some interesting depictions of the court of the Dzungar ruler. I mentioned this story about the child who was brought up among the Dzungars. Well, what happens then is that this claim is made that, he's my son, can I have him back? And the Dzungar ruler, he assembles this court at which he seats the Mongolian judges on one side, and then the Islamic scholars on the other side, and he's sort of holding court on this basis. And I don't think that that's necessarily a kind of an unrealistic depiction of what was actually going on in the Dzungar state. I mean, there were Muslims employed at various different levels. You get some mention here of the merchants that the Dzungars were using, the Muslim merchants, the Bazargan, as they're known. You get there's quite a few characters who have at some point been slaves to the Dzungars and then have kind of come back and risen to positions of status. So I think it's a really interesting text from that point of view, and I'm hoping that people with an interest in Mongolian history would pick this up and see what they can say about it, because I find this question really it's really enigmatic, and it's still but just it's always important to keep in mind that, when the Qing Empire stepped into the Tarim Basin, they were not stepping into a society that was just this pristine Islamic community kind of cut off from anything else. It was a place that had long been in engagement with this this non-Muslim Buddhist power, and engaged in a way that really offered quite a lot of upward mobility for Muslims within that system.
All right. So just kind of a quick note to the audience in the room. So we plan to wrap up our program in about 5 minutes, but we do want to create this as much of an in-person experience as possible. So after the official program is closed, so we will keep Professor Brophy here for about maybe 10 minutes. So at that moment, if you have to go on for some other things, you are welcome to leave and then can join us for the future events. And if you want to stay around for another 8 to 10 minutes, and that's also possible. And let me get one more question, and before we kind of really have a more interactive experience. So here's a question from Quentin Huang, and I'm just going to read. I'm curious, this text barely mentions the Qing and yet is produced under the Qing and the context of the invasion. So what your thoughts are about how to situate this period and the text between a Qing-centered history and historiography and a Central Asian one?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, look, I think that we don't want to have sort of simplistic expectations about what we're going to find when we open up texts from, say, Qianlong period Xinjiang. If we expect that we're going to find some sort of new Qing history, Islamic, rationale for, Qing Empire and, some sort of Islamic view of the emperor, we're not finding that here. And I believe kind of talking to Tibetologists as well, that, I think they sort of feel the same thing, that sometimes people imagine that, everyone in the Qianlong period was writing about, Qianlong as bodhisattva or something, and they weren't. Okay, so having said that, I think that this is also, this is not the same thing as, the tradition of historiography to the West in the rest of Central Asia, that is reconstituted on the basis of these revived Khanate traditions in Kokand, Bukhara, and so on. And so they don't produce texts like this either. And so what I would be interested in doing, if I wanted to sort of try to situate this in some kind of, say, like, Qing context and wider Qing context, would be to think about the way in which this, the position of these elites who are patronizing this text, both in relation to the Qing court and relation to this literary political tradition that they're tapping into here. Is there something we can sort of abstract from this that is reflective, in a sense, of the way that people are positioning themselves in other traditions in, say, Mongolia and Tibet? That's a sort of that's a bit of a reach, I know, but that's more the kind of thing that I would be interested in exploring. Yeah, but it's a really good question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just read the my official final message, before people just leave the room, and then we'll come back. As I promised to everybody, we're gonna keep Professor Brophy here for another 10 minutes. So we will still do this Q&A sessions after my official final message. So here we go. So the let's say, right. So this is our inaugural lecture, and for this Global Qing and its Legacy lecture series. So the next one is coming up on April the 2nd. It's also Friday, also in the afternoon at 3 o'clock in the Central Time. So the title is a Tea War, A History of Capitalism in China and India. So we will, we will have the speaker talk about this national drink in China and its role in growing this sort of global capitalism between imperial China and colonial India. So just wait for our emails, and we'll be happy to see you again in our next event. So now let's get back to Professor Brophy. So we have about maybe 8 minutes left. And so if you want to ask your question, and you can just use the raise your hand. So we'll call you, and you can just turn on your camera and unmute, and then just ask your question yourself. And so we try to have a little more conversational style. And so I believe we have, Ulu, and you are ready to ask your question?
Oh yeah, of course, of course. Well, thank you, David, once again for joining us, and also just for translating this book. I mean, I know it took you 15 years to do it, but one of the, I think, main problems that we have in our field, and I think a lot of historians are feeling this, especially right now, is teaching Xinjiang, and people don't really know what kind of sources to use while they teach these Xinjiang. So I think now we have that one source at least that we can use. I'm really curious to hear about the process of translation. And I'm especially curious to hear about what kind of conceptual and philological difficulties you encountered in translating this text from Chaghatay. I know there were also some Persian elements in it. There's probably some Mongolian and Manchu elements in it too. But so there's sort of the linguistic side of it. But I think what I'm most curious about is the more conceptual parts of it.
Yeah. So when I sort of set out originally on this, I was doing, I was originally thinking I was going to maybe publish the text along with translation, and I was imagining a fairly sort of, philological sort of translation with footnotes and this sort of stuff, and anything that was sort of difficult or complicated, you can just kind of put a footnote in or whatever. And as the project developed, I just kind of went in took it in a more sort of, ended up wanting it, to have something that's more accessible, more affordable for people. And, then you get rid of the footnotes, and all of a sudden you're confronted with the challenge of having to try to make a text that's readable without any support, because people are unlikely to kind of flip back all the way through. And that was quite daunting. And I had to, I had to gradually sort of filter out a lot of the terminology that I might have left in, to try to sort of translate most of that. The flow of the texts in the hagiographic sections is quite difficult, right? Because you can have a hagiographic text, which is, so-and-so told me that, the master one day said that, this disciple said, and it's all embedded, right? And to try to present that on a page and punctuate it and whatever was kind of a nightmare. But yeah, in terms of sort of, the other problem is that you're dealing with, some of the Persian poetry, for example. Now, I believe Kashgari was well educated, and he could, he knew what he was doing when he was using this material. But I don't believe that all of the people copying this text understood and knew this material. So that gets corrupted really easily. And so we can't, sometimes I would sort of have to go to like, sometimes I just had to replace what was in the text with what was, from someone's divan or something, just to make sense of it. Had to sort of do a bit of repair work on the text, because in the copying process, the Persian and Arabic as well gets a little bit lost. There's some interesting traps that you can fall into as well. in the doctrinal section, when he's talking, he's citing all these hadiths and these quotations from these Arabic works to try to prove that Hoja Yaqub is a Sayyid and so on. And I couldn't for the life of me find, he says the author of the book, and he says in his book, he says this, and I'm just spending hours in the library looking through things, and so on. And eventually I talked to some real Islamic studies experts, and they said, like, he's probably just making this reference up, he's just like, he just wants to sound authoritative, and he's saying he found this in this book, but he's probably just making it up, and so it's like, yeah. I mean, that's not a translation issue so much, but it was real eye opener in terms of the possible pitfalls here.
All right. So, Ulu, do you have another question? Or I can ask. I can get maybe one more question from the audience.
Exactly. I mean, I do have another question, but the audience should definitely ask.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we have, from Wei Wei He. I think still, I don't know, is he or she still here? So why was Kashgar always the center of a revolt and rebellion against the central Chinese government? The region is geography, history, or religion? What's your take? What's your thought?
Okay. I don't know if I'd completely subscribe to the idea that Kashgar was always the center, but I do get your point. I mean, there's a lot of the Sufi rebellions in the Qing period are centered on Kashgar, and Kashgar was known as the stronghold of the White Mountain Sufis, is the shrine of Hoja Afaq, and there were people in Kashgar who were tended to be more hostile to the heroes of this text from the other branch of the family. So it goes back to sort of late 17th century, really. You get this rivalry between Kashgar and Yarkand in terms that's sort of reflected in different loyalties to different members of the Sufi elite group. Now, it just so happened that in the way that the Qing conquest played out, ultimately it was the Black Mountain faction who are associated with Yarkand who kind of won out, really. But it's not, you don't want to sort of interpret everything in terms of those divisions. I mean, the other thing that's going on in the Qing is that people from the north, people from Tufan, are coming down to sort of administer the south as well. But you can tell a story if you're interested in why Kashgar seems more rebellious than anywhere else. You can trace that story back to the 17th century. Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Sure. Yes. Let's take this is going to be the last question. All
Okay.
right.
Hello, David. Nice to meet you. My name is Qudrat, and I am Uyghur. My question is also in the chat, which was, is there any mention of the word Uyghur as an ethnic identity or language in the book itself? It seems some other groups were mentioned in the region by name. And the reason why I want to understand this is because I'm an Uyghur who grew up in exile. So I want to understand what it meant to be Uyghur during that period of time and how it evolved and what's the relationship of that versus today. For example, the author Muhammad Sadiq Kashgari, would he consider himself Uyghur at that time? Do you think so?
No. So the term Uyghur, he might have been familiar with it as a sort of a historical term, but it's difficult to know. Basically, with the conversion to Islam, the term kind of falls out of use, right? It's not to say that people didn't have a sort of a sense of some kind of community here, you know, in the way that he uses this term Musliman. I think he, you know, that is reflected there, but they're not referring to themselves as Uyghur. Now, it's possible that there was some geographic variation. We don't have a lot of sources from Hami, Turpan, where, you know, it might have survived a little bit more. But, you know, so he's Kashgari. There are, you know, it's the divisions, you know, Yarkandi and so on, that plays a role, Khotani. In terms of Uyghur, it's, I mean, my first book engages this question quite a lot. And it really is like, you know, like all kind of modern nationalisms, it's a revival of a narrative that begins sort of in the early 20th century, when people start to say, look, we've forgotten our identity, and it's really important that we reclaim this, you know, this sense of being Uyghur. It's not enough to just say we are Muslims, we are Turks, you know, we have to have this distinctive national identity. And, you know, peoples around the world are doing the same thing at that time. But and then it's really consolidated around the time of, or just after the Russian Revolution. So if you're interested in that history, then, you know, you could, yeah, my first book is on that topic. So I'll just put the reference in the chat. Yeah.
So David, do you want to take one more question? So we still have one hand.
Oh, I'm happy to. Yeah, why not?
Sure.
Okay.
So, yes,
I think
go ahead.
yeah, thank you so much, David, Professor David. Like, I really appreciate your talk. Yeah, I've been following your works like so far, and it's really it's a lot contribution, especially in today's context that Uyghurs and what's happening in Eastern Turkestan is horrible. And you and other professors like Ryan Thumb and Eric, you know, has been contributing to translate and work on the Chaghatay manuscripts. So I was really interested that when I was reading your book, the first introduction, you kind of mentioned that the first time you read at Harvard, like with the professor with Thaxton, right? When you were learning it, you kind of attached the text. Like, what was the main thing that you were attracted to this text while there are too many manuscripts? So
yeah. Look, when I was reading it with Wheeler Thaxton, we would just pick out certain passages, and mostly from the second half of the book, when the narrative becomes quite fast paced, you know, and it sort of takes on the style of a historical novel, because he's using a lot of dialogue. He is quoting documents that are probably not original documents, but, you know, it makes it feel like you're really in the middle of this, you know, the action. He's composing this letter and he's sending it, and then and there's a lot of sort of stories of plots, of conspiracies, you know, betrayals, and so on. And honestly, it's actually, in terms of Central Asian texts that I've read, it's actually quite a compelling read. You know, it's actually really quite enjoyable. I mean, there's some really funny stories. You know, there's a story about, there's a Jungar emissary who, you know, wants to go and like capture one of the Hodjas, and he, you know, but he's scared of going to, you know, visit him at his court. So he says like, well, let's lure him to our house. And there's this whole description about how he sort of fills his mouth with pomegranate juice and lies there with the pomegranate juice coming out to like look like blood, to say like, you know, he's sick, he's dying, you know, you've got to come and visit him. And there's all sorts of like really quite enjoyable stories like that. And so that was really what hooked me. And it was sort of, it was that, and this sort of dissatisfaction with not being able to kind of look at a text as a whole, right? And this sort of idea that like, you know, we don't just want to search through these texts looking for names, looking for events, looking for dates, that kind of thing, kind of extracting information, but try to see if there's something more that we can do when we consume this thing as a whole and we get a sense of really what the author is trying to achieve. That was sort of what drove me on to finish, because I mean, there are parts that are not as fun as well. I mean, yeah, on the whole, it was something that I always found difficult to justify doing, you know, because as an academic, you know, translations don't count for very much. We're meant to be writing articles and, you know, writing monographs and so on, but every now and then, if I had a few weeks spare, I would get into it, push it along, and then I would have to set it aside for a couple of years or something. So, yeah.
David, we have one more hand. You want to take the question?
Oh, I'm not going anywhere. Yep.
Okay. All right, so Samir, Asta.
Hi, thank you for your contribution. I'd like to ask that to what extent and how we should use this text for historical research.
Yeah, good question. Well, it's a little bit like what I was just saying. I mean, there's traditionally people have tended to try to mine these texts, right? So you dig in, you dig around, and you try to find a little chunk of information or something like that, and that you can use for something else. I feel like we need to kind of try to do something a little bit different with these kinds of works. I feel like that has mostly been done. Like if someone wants to write a history of the Hodjas, right? I mean, all the information that is in this book is already in the articles from, you know, 100 years ago, because that's what people were doing. You know, they wanted to use it just as a normal historical source. I'm interested more in thinking about things like, you know, the history of, I mean, genre, the question of historiography more generally. I mean, Kashgari, you know, he's someone who had, you know, he also translated things like Tabari. Now, I'm not familiar with Tabari particularly, but, you know, are there things in this text, in his style of narrating this history that reflect the influence of, you know, classical works like that? I mean, it's obvious, like when I was talking about the child who was brought up under the Dzungars. I mean, he when they brought him back, they gave him the name Yusuf, which is of course Joseph, you know, the man who went from captivity to, you know, position of authority. And like, you sort of have to wonder, is this kind of biblical Quranic story actually helping to shape this this narration here as well? So those are more the kinds of things that I'm interested in. Like, I don't think just by doing a really thorough translation we can get all this new information. But I think if we're interested in things like you know, literary history and kind of trying to construct a, you know, the kind of the, you know, the worldview of an author in the late 18th century, then I think, you know, putting in the effort to do something like this is worthwhile.
How about this Chaghatay historical sources suppressed by Chinese authorities? Can we get access to them any soon?
Well, I mean, things in China, I've never personally been able to do serious manuscript research in China, except for one time in Beijing, where at the there's one library in Beijing where I was able to, but I've never had any luck in Urumqi or anywhere else. So I do most of my work in, I mean, look, for better or for worse, a lot of these manuscripts are outside China. And, you know, Sweden, the Yaring collection, London, there's a lot, You've got stuff scattered through America. I think one of the most kind of interesting places to work is Tashkent, where there's a huge collection, including a lot from East Turkestan that, and it's, you can still find interesting things that haven't really been studied. So it's really sad, of course, the situation. And it's a tragic, that we may not be possible to sort of engage with colleagues or do research on materials in China for some time. We can always hope that things will improve, but right now it's not. But we do have resources outside China. And just one last thing. I mean, on the Yaring collection, or the Yaring collection in Sweden, they're digitizing a lot of materials as well. And in fact, so is people in Berlin. So there's more and more material becoming available in digital form as well. So that's particularly valuable in the pandemic, of course.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, so with that, I think we will officially close today's program. And, I want to thank Professor Brophy for spending his Saturday morning with us from Sydney. And thank you all for coming to our event. And so we will have more exciting talks down the road. So for sure to come back, and we'll see you next time. And so have a good weekend, everybody.